So for me, this isn't a side job you do a little bit later. This was a full career trajectory that started off in a wheelchair. You're listening to the Fit Muslima podcast, where we discuss the interconnection between food, faith, and fitness. I'm your host, Mubarakah Ibrahim. This podcast, my social media presence, and my weekly newsletter all focus on the philosophy that physical, mental, and spiritual well-being is intertwined. The weakness of one weakens them all, and the strengthening of one strengthens them all. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to episode 3 of the Fit Muslima podcast. This season is the season I'm sharing the stories that make the book of me. So as you listen to this podcast, you'll better understand my perspective, the lens in which I review health, fitness, and the world. In my life, I often describe some of the biggest shifts as feeling as if I am in Allah's bow and arrow. I am pulled back by a circumstance and then thrusted forward in a direction that I may not have necessarily intended, but I was destined to go. One of those circumstances surrounded my pregnancy of my first child. So when I got pregnant with my first son, it began as a normal pregnancy. I had some very normal periodic morning sickness. I didn't gain too much weight. It was all going the way that it should go. When I was probably about 5 months pregnant, I started to have a pain in my pelvic area, right at the top of my pelvic bone, right underneath my belly. Now, I come from a woman and a family where there's lots of pregnancies, lots of births. My oldest sister alone has 7 children. So I began to ask, is this normal? And initially, some of the responses that I got back from friends and family was, it's probably just the skin of your stomach stretching. You're probably just feeling the baby starting to gain a little weight. But to me, I said, I don't think it's that. It's like literally my bone. It aches. So I finally decided to mention it to my doctor. I went to a regular doctor's appointment and I mentioned my pelvic bone, it aches. And they sort of brushed it off. It was my first pregnancy. One doctor actually said to me, "Is this your first pregnancy?" I said, "Yes." She was like, "It's just the growing pains of the baby." Okay. I mentioned it again at a follow-up appointment and I got the same response. So it was my first pregnancy. Maybe they were right. Maybe nothing was wrong. Now, at the time, my husband and I, when we found out that we were having a baby, he goes and gets a second job. So most days of the week, I made dinner for myself and I was able to sit down in front of the TV, eat my dinner, have some alone time, and my husband came home later. So one particular evening, I made myself something to eat and I went and I sat down on the couch and watched TV with my plate in front of me. I did what I normally do. When I was done eating, I stood up to go put my plate inside of the sink and wash it. And when I stood up, I collapsed to the floor. When I think back at that moment, it wasn't painful. I was more concerned about whether or not I fell on my belly than whether or not I actually hurt myself. But with this quick mental scan of my body, I actually didn't feel any pain. So I'm like, maybe I just lost my balance. So I go to push myself up off of the floor And I get as high as my hands and my knees, and I just couldn't quite pull my legs to come up. So I laid back down. I couldn't move. I had quite a few, I think about 6 hours before my husband was to come home. But in my mind, I was like, it's okay. I can lay here until he comes home. Was not a good plan, by the way. So after laying on the floor for probably about 2 hours, I finally decided, no, I'm not going to be able to lay here until he comes home. So I took my arms and I pulled my body to the door in hopes to get the attention of my upstairs neighbor. Now, unfortunately, we actually did not have a telephone. And this was way before the internet was even invented or cell phones even came out. All right, I'm aging myself a little. So I'm in the house by myself, no form of communication. I go to pull myself with my arm to the door. I was able to reach up and turn the doorknob and open up the door and pull myself with my arm into the hallway. Now, we lived in a 2-story apartment. So we lived on the first floor. We had neighbors that lived upstairs. So I laid in the hallway and I began to yell out, "Hello, can somebody help me? I need some help." My neighbors knew I was pregnant. Unfortunately, the wife was not home. So there's a husband, a wife, 2 small children. I think they were like 4 and 6 years old. I was yelling, "Can I use your phone? I need some help." The gentleman gave the phone to the 4-year-old little girl who walked downstairs, looked at me on the floor, and handed me the phone and then went back upstairs to her dad. He didn't even come downstairs to check to see what I needed help with. So I first tried to call my mother-in-law who lived across town. Did not get an answer. And I'm like, I'm going to try again because maybe she can just help me and my husband doesn't have to leave work early. So I tried her several times, could not get a hold of her. So I had to call my husband's job at the time. He worked as a evening cook at Friendly's restaurant. So I called him, told him I fell, I'm on the floor, and I can't get up, and I need him to come home. About 15, 20 minutes later, he arrives home. He picks me up off of the floor, puts me on the bed, and then begins to ask me like what happened. And I just tell him what's happening. And I'm telling him like, I can't move my legs. So he calls the ambulance. The ambulance comes, and this was our first apartment. It was very small, really, really small. It was 1 bedroom, but the bedroom, what was designated as the bedroom, was actually too small for us to fit a queen size bed in it because it would literally take up 95% of the room. So what was supposed to be the living room, we actually used as our bedroom because it was larger. And we used the room that was designated as a bedroom as our living room. So the hallway itself was also small. So the ambulance comes, the EMS checks the baby's heart rate, everything is good. And they asked me what happened. And I described to them that, when I tried to stand up, I just collapsed to the floor and I can't move my legs. So they're looking at me and they're like, okay, so we're going to take you to the hospital. And they go and they get the stretcher. They bring the stretcher into the hallway, into the doorway. but it cannot fit into the bedroom next to the bed that I'm laying on because it was such small amount of space, it would not be able to come so that they can put me on a stretcher. So the EMS, I don't know if like they didn't believe me or something. They were like, we just need you to walk about 10 feet to get on the stretcher. And I looked at them and I said, did you not hear what I said before that I can't move my legs? I know you can't, but if you can just take a couple of steps, we can support you. Did you not hear what I just told you? I cannot move my legs. I am not making it up. I am not being dramatic. I physically cannot move my legs. Now, I was pretty big, relatively big when I'm pregnant. So I'm sure that this female EMS person was probably like, I'm not going to be able to lift her. So my husband said, I will pick her up and put her on the stretcher. So my husband picked me up. He took me into the hallway where they had the stretcher and he put me on the stretcher. That was only part one of this very interesting adventure. We get into the ambulance, and I forgot to mention that there were two EMS persons. One was a female, one was a male, and the male was very clearly drunk. You could smell the alcohol on him. And unfortunately, he was the driver. So we get into the ambulance. The female EMS person sits in the back with me, along with my husband. And the clearly inebriated male EMS drives. And several times she had to instruct him to slow down. I was not in pain when the event happened, but every time he would hit a bump in the road and my body would jerk up and down and bounce on the stretcher, I would let out a very loud moan because that is when the pain would sort of push through my body. So she kept telling him, she's fine, she's stable, you can slow down. You can slow down, she's fine, she's stable. I guess reassuring him that it wasn't a life and death emergency of getting to the hospital, and slowing down would not change my condition. So we finally get to the hospital. They are doing all of their regular doctor checks. They want to make sure that the baby is okay, the baby is fine, all of these things. They couldn't figure out why I couldn't walk. So they admitted me to the hospital and they wanted to make sure that it was nothing going on with the pregnancy or with the baby itself. I was in the hospital for about 2 weeks. 2 weeks because much of their diagnostic tools could not be used on me because I was pregnant. They couldn't put me in an x-ray machine. They couldn't do other types of tests that they wanted to do because I was pregnant. And so much of their diagnosis was watching, looking at vitals. I probably got an ultrasound a couple of times while I was there to make sure that the baby was okay. So after about 2 weeks, I guess I was taking up the hospital bed too long, the doctor comes in and tells me, we won't have a definitive diagnosis until after you give birth and we're able to do an x-ray and proper testing. But we think you have pelvic synthesis, which is the collapse of the pelvic bone. This is actually not an uncommon thing to happen to pregnant women, but generally it happens about 48 hours before a woman gives birth. My case was unusual because it happened a full 3 months before I gave birth. So what pelvic synthesis is when when it's time for the birth to actually happen, when you are in active labor, your brain then releases chemicals to tell your pelvic bone to literally open and separate to make room for the baby to come out. So this is a natural part of the physical way in which a woman is able to take a full baby and push it out of her vagina in between her pelvic bone. We don't give birth with our pelvic bones actually together. Our pelvic bone actually opens up in order for the baby to be able to fit through. In pelvic synthesis, those hormones and signals get mixed up and your body releases them too early. My body released those signals 3 months before I gave birth. So our pelvic bone, that's normally 2 pieces, now opens up, and I had a 6-inch gap between them. That interrupted that brain to leg nerve that I could actually sit on a bed, get help to a standing position. But when my brain told my legs to step forward, it did not receive the signal. When it initially happened, I literally just, the legs would not move. I wasn't paralyzed. So let me clarify that. I could feel, right, in my legs. You touch my leg, I know you're touching my leg. You move my foot, you stick a pin in me, I'm going to say, ouch, it hurts. All of those nerves were there. Nothing wrong with my spine. It was literally the signal from my brain to my legs that got confused, is what I say. I spent another few days in the hospital, and then they came to tell me, there's nothing medically wrong with you. There's nothing we need to actually treat you for. So we're going to send you to a rehab facility. And we're going to observe you for a few more days. And then after those few days, if you're okay with going home, we'll send you home. Now, I got sent to a physical rehab facility that was like something out of a scary movie. That's a whole nother story for another day. My husband ended up taking me home the next day because I felt safer and better in my own home. So the last trimester of my pregnancy, I was actually in a wheelchair. I would navigate from my bed. I learned how to use my arms to push myself off of my bed, to put myself onto a wheelchair, to roll myself to the bathroom. I had to learn how to push from a wheelchair onto the toilet seat. I had a home health aide that would come to help me get myself into the shower and sit down. We actually, thank goodness, we actually had a standing shower and not a tub. That would have been a nightmare. We actually had a shower and no tub in this apartment. And so she would come and I would shower after her assistance of getting in the shower and being able to sit down. And I did this for 3 months. It was a very stark difference to my very active life where I could go anywhere I wanted, do anything. I could jump on the bus, go ride a bike, go running, go walking, right? It was such a huge difference. But it was also a blessing. I look at it as both a lesson and a blessing. Spiritually, it actually brought me closer to God because I realized how much of a privilege it is to have the physical ability to be able to walk, to be able to see, to be able to hear, and how quickly God can take it away. In an instant, there was no sort of, hey, you're not going to be able to walk tomorrow. Just letting you know. Hey, you can't feel your toe today. Now you can't feel your knee. Now you can't walk. Nope, did not come on like that. Just literally, I walked to the couch. I sat down. I ate. I stood up. And just like that, I could not walk. The other thing that it did for my life is it completely changed the trajectory of my life. This is actually what got me to become a health and fitness coach. So one of the things that happened when I was in the wheelchair is I gained 50 pounds. Now, as I mentioned previously in the story, my husband worked at Friendly's restaurant. If you're not familiar, it is a fast food establishment whose key product is ice cream. So every night, he brought home ice cream because I was a little sad at the beginning. And what cheered me up was an ice cream float and a movie. So he would stop by. If you live in the United States, you remember Blockbuster, because this was before we had access to the internet and all of the other stuff that we have access to now. There was no Netflix. There was no what do you call it? Pay-per-view. None of that exists. This was in 1994. 1994. Actually, it was in 1993 because my son was born in February. It was in 1993. So he would stop at Blockbuster, get us a movie, bring home some ice cream and some root beer. And most of the time, he got home 11, 12 o'clock at night. We would have an ice cream float and watch a movie. That was our time together. When I got pregnant, I was 115 pounds. When I gave birth, I was 198 pounds. I'd like to say that most of that was baby, but in fact, it was not. At my 6-week appointment, I was still 186 pounds. I physically could not see my feet. 186 pounds on a 5'5" frame for me was very different. It was the largest that I have ever been in my life. Even to this day, that was the peak of how much I ever weighed. And I was afraid. My mother had diabetes. Her mother had diabetes. My father had high blood pressure. He died from a stroke induced by high blood pressure. We don't think he knew he even had high blood pressure. And I did not know a lot about health and fitness, but I knew that weight and fitness level had a huge impact, that nutrition had a huge impact. And so after I gave birth to my son, I started reading anything about nutrition and fitness that I could get my hands on. And I put together a meal plan for myself. Now, to this day, I absolutely refuse to eat egg whites and salsa together because I was traumatized by that 3-month experience. I can't remember what my macros were or what my calories were. All I know is I ate a lot of egg whites and salsa because apparently it fit within the macros I was trying to achieve. Today, I don't even want to see those two things next to each other. I keep my salsa on a different in a different part of the fridge than I keep my eggs. Don't even put them next to each other. Now, I lost the weight. Alhamdulillah. So by my anniversary, so I had my son on February the 8th. My anniversary was June 27th. By my anniversary, I had gotten down to, I believe, 120 pounds. So I went from 186 to 120. I lost the weight, and women in the masjid started asking me, how did I lose my baby weight? And so I started to tell them, and they went, well, can you help me? Can you make me a meal plan? Can you tell me what exercises to do? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I would actually meet with women and help them put together a weight loss plan. And so I remember one day I was helping a friend of mine, and she looked at me and she said, Mubarakah, you know what? You're really good at this. You should become a personal trainer. And I was like, you can make money doing this? Honestly, I had no idea what a personal trainer was. I had literally never ever stepped inside of a gym before in my life. It was never necessary for me. When I was like 13, I started to ask my mom if I can go running before school. I would run a few miles, 2-3 miles, come back home. I just wanted to be physically active, right? I never thought about I need to go into a gym and exercise. I was a teenager. So I was like, wow, I can do this for a living. Now, thus far in my career goals, I wanted to be a writer ever since I was a little girl. I went to a high school that was an arts high school, and you chose a major, and my major was creative writing. When I graduated high school, I went to college and I majored in English. At this time, I actually was majoring in English and minoring in psychology at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut. I started looking into what it means and what you needed in order to be a personal trainer. Then I discovered that the college across town offered exercise science as a major. So I chucked the year that I had spent in college thus far. I think it was a semester. I don't think I had done a full year. And I switched colleges, switched majors. Many of the classes that I had taken, I thought that I would never be able to use them. I ended up being able to incorporate them into my degree later on. And so I began a career in education in exercise science. Now, life for me does not happen in a straight trajectory. So, my education in health and fitness sort of went like become a certified personal trainer, take a semester of classes, have a baby, take some time off, go get a few more certifications, do another few semesters, have another baby, take some time off. Let's repeat that cycle over and over again for about 8 years. So, in that time, I accumulated 13 fitness and nutrition certifications, including personal trainer, master personal trainer, female specific training, exercise and nutrition. And then I graduated with an interdisciplinary degree in exercise science, public health, and psychology. I was able to combine my three most passionate interests into a encompassing degree. So I have a bachelor's in exercise science, public health, and psychology, and 13 fitness and nutrition certifications. In that process, taught thousands of women in my outdoor fitness boot camp, the physical studio space that I owned for 8 years, and online. So for me, this isn't a side job you do a little bit later. This was a full career trajectory that started off in a wheelchair. Now, I tell you this story in hopes that it will do a few things. Number one, it will help you understand my personal commitment to health and wellness. And number two, help you understand that I'm pretty much very well aware that life doesn't happen in the sequential order that we plan it. But the important thing is to keep your eyes on your purpose and keep moving forward. Thank you for listening to episode 3 of the Fit Muslimah podcast. Please make sure that you subscribe, share, rate this podcast, and join the conversation. Find me on Instagram or YouTube at Fit Muslimah, FitMuslimah. Until next time. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, share, and rate this podcast. And you can find me on most social media platforms, including Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Fit Muslimah. Join the conversation.